One thing that I think we have talked about storage and batteries and etc. That's great. But I think one other thing that we haven't talked about is demand side response. And I think this really ties in nicely with what Lord Deben was telling us about in terms of should we check each of our choices are sustainable or not. So that's what I want to cover in my talk. So in terms of, I think, I can't remember, was it Hugh or Peter mentioned, but yeah, we know that renewables are important, right? We have the Climate Change Act, and with the Net Zero Strategy published last year, the government has committed that by 2035, we want to have clean energy system. So that means we want to have loads and loads of renewable energy in the networks. And leaving aside all the discussions around in terms of complexities about grid connection and grid stability issues, etc., that's what we want to have. We know that we just can't do without that because, and this chart here is from National Grid Future Energy Scenarios, which are published annually, and indeed it shows that from current installed capacity of around 50 gigawatt of renewables, we want to increase it by 4-fold or 5-fold. But you see that there's a big difference between different scenarios because the customer leading the way, the system transformation scenario and consumer transformation are the ones in which individuals start doing things differently, and you will see that there's a slight difference in terms of amount of generation that we need to install. And I think one other thing that renewables are important, which Jenny mentioned, which I was quite pleased, role of renewables also using a storage medium and generating hydrogen. And actually, we know that there are some sectors where decarbonization is much harder to do than other sectors, such as aviation or heavy goods vehicles, because of the density requirements. Batteries may not necessarily be a viable solution, at least in the short term. That's why we need to look into use of renewables to produce hydrogen as well. But again, on that, I will raise another point. So just to highlight, so my first message is, yeah, renewables are central. We need more of it. And we just have to manage what does that mean for the rest of energy system. And actually, my question is whether there are other ways of managing the issues, the stability or frequency issues that renewables create on the system through other means. And indeed, again, this is from National Grid's Future Energy Scenarios. And here, what I want to focus on is demand-side flexibility. So it's the idea that actually consumers can do something about. If we could give them signals so that they shift their energy use to another time period, that means we lower our demand, and actually we can use our assets much more efficiently and effectively. So a personal anecdote, my current supplier is Octopus, and yesterday I received an invite to take part in the demand side to reduce our load between 5:30 and 6:30 in the evening. My 13-year-old son, he was adamant that he needed to charge his phone at 6 o'clock. I was like, you have enough charge. You could just wait for another 22 minutes, I think, by then or something. And he was like, no, I want to charge it now. So I know that demand-side response is not going to be easy, but that is going to be an essential solution that we have to do. Otherwise, our costs are going to increase and increase, and we don't want to build power plants that we only operate a few hours in a day. So I think the next thing also we see in terms of when we think about flexibility and demand-side response, we talked about batteries. Another form of batteries are electric vehicles, and we want to decarbonize our energy system. So we want people to move from fossil fuel cars, and indeed, by 2035, all the vehicles, we won't have any new sale of fossil fuel-based vehicles. So once we have around 28 million electric vehicles on the road, that could be our battery that we could use in terms of providing energy back to the grid, right? So that's another solution that we want to utilize. And indeed, in terms of electric vehicles, again, another anecdote from our research is that we are seeing households actually, rather than saying, oh, I have two cars as a family, my car and my husband's car or my partner's car, actually they are thinking more about, okay, who needs what kind of journey today, so that then we swap electric vehicle is used for that purpose versus this purpose. So I think that societal change is taking place, even though it's not at the pace that it needs to be. And one other thing I also want to highlight, that when we think about obviously these solutions, we should also recognize that some of these could be at individual level, so in my individual choice, but also we know that actually some of these solutions also make sense at community level. In other words, if we have seen lots of success in terms of, for example, community renewable energy projects, and whether we could be known to that consumer engagement in terms of communities sharing a battery, or even maybe when we think about new housing developments, could there be solutions that are at, again, community level? So that's a point that I wanted to highlight. And in terms of, that's what, because we know that Committee on Climate Change as well as government thinks that, there will be low carbon heating is a big problem, and that the business models innovation are needed for low carbon heating as well. So this is from our recent research where the point about can we look into community level solutions. Actually, in this study, it was individual level. So we said, okay, we know that Oxford-Cambridge ARC we want to grow that. So this is these are four different areas within that ARC that had they had housing planning consent. So what we said was, okay, if these homes were built smart, which means that they had solar panels, they had batteries, are there smart ways of managing those the growth, the connection capacity requirements? So in other words, Steve's point about when we think about connection capacity and etc., actually there are other smart solutions in which if these individual homes, even though electric vehicles will increase the demand, the loads at individual or household level, if we could put solar panels and if we could give incentives to households to shift their energy use to other time periods, and then I think, batteries as well, we show that on different July and January, obviously, the loads or the capacity connection requirements of those housing developments could be lowered. So I think if we are thinking about innovation and solutions, which we discussed earlier on, maybe one other innovation is that, we need to incorporate those systems thinking or smart solutions from the start of these type of projects or other projects, so that we don't incur additional capacity connection, or we don't wait for a few years to build that grid connection capacity. The next point that I wanted to highlight is around green electrolysis. And again, my view is that, yes, hydrogen is a versatile fuel. We could use it in rail, in aviation potentially in the future, in HGVs, or even in industry because of the densities that it could provide. So again, this shows, the graph on the left shows the different expected hydrogen demands under different scenarios that could enable UK become net zero by 2050. But then we know that, okay, electrolysis requires water. So we did a quick analysis to see how much water will be needed corresponding to produce that hydrogen. And actually with water, we know that even though we can store water, it matters when, it matters where, and how much. So for example, in East Anglia, for example, where the water it's flat, so there is already pumping water requires lots of energy use, and also water resources are limited. So can we should we be then looking into not only energy policy or renewable energy policy, but actually in case of hydrogen or other cases, should we look into across sectors, water and energy sector together, so that our solutions are not having unintended consequences on other sectors? And in particular, this is work that we are undertaking where when we think about decarbonization and etc., obviously it's quite complex, and that there are different services. We talked about natural capital and ecosystem services and biodiversity, etc. And then obviously we have then different actors or stakeholders operating in the landscape in terms of local or citizens or national or etc. And then also in terms of what does it mean, the risks and liabilities. There might be risks in terms of economic savings, or maybe there might be benefits in terms of service quality loss and etc. So it is regulation and policy as a framework really touches upon has impacts on interaction of services and risks and liabilities, but not necessarily in terms of the capital itself. So in other words, resource as a amount of water rather than how much water we are abstracting. I think there is a bigger role here in terms of taking a systems approach and recognizing that these interactions are quite complex. And actually one thing that I haven't seen being discussed so far is the role of data and digitization. And in the previous session, there was comment about remote sensing data and etc. And I know that in the UK, for example, our distribution networks aren't digital, so we have much better visibility at transmission network level, but not so much at distribution network level. So we still have analog meters in many of the transformers, and even though we know what is the peak demand, we don't know how long that peak demand lasted. When was it? Was it once a year, twice a year, 3 times a year, etc.? So I think data and digitization is going to be really, really important. And I think that also has implications in terms of natural capital markets that we were talking about earlier, where we said, oh, we want to have transparency. We want to know that a forestry is in place for 30 years and etc. So I think that data and digitization across markets could play a really important role. The second point that I would like to highlight is that consumer proposition in terms of improving well-being, in terms of improving health and wider benefits, I think need to be clear. I am sure you have seen recent articles on the media about whether the health sector GPs could prescribe heat to vulnerable customers, because we know that provision of heat could help with avoiding certain health problems, right? So thinking that systems approach and recognizing that customer proposition is not necessarily pence per kilowatt hour, but actually maybe it is about amount of carbon that I reduce by taking part in a demand-side response project, or other economic savings that I provide into electricity network. I think we need to recognize that consumers or households have different value propositions, and we need to find what tunes with different types of consumers. And I think third point I want to highlight is that when we think about obviously energy system decarbonization, or even I would think that when we like housing developments or other things, it needs to be indeed what Lord Debon was saying in terms of that social license to operate, to ensure that decisions we are making today aren't going to have unintended consequences in the future, and that the risks and responsibilities and benefits across the supply chain, across different households is defined, is quite important. I think with that, this is my last slide, and with that I will stop and will be keen to take any questions anyone has. Thank you.